This is day 5 of the November 89 7-day retreat at Springwater. Somebody mentioned that yesterday in talking about thinking and mentioning that thought is always fragmenting, being itself a fragment. The person said, how about talking in a talk? Is that fragmenting? Is that a fragment? Or can thought also be clarifying? I don't know right now what those two are antagonistic. A thought can be fragmenting and yet clarifying in a limited way. We have to look at it. But I must admit, in saying it at the time, it occurred to me that some reservation should be made at that moment, which I did not make. That even in talking right now, thought is operating, and yet it's not felt to be dividing me from you or cutting up this universe, even though what is talked about is a part, maybe fear. We talked yesterday extensively about fear. And yet in talking about it, it wasn't felt that fear is sort of something separate from the rest of all the other emotions and feelings, the body, the brain, our community in which we live, and all humankind, which is not separate from the earth and the sky and the stars. And yes, thought and thinking, making something clear intellectually, can be clarifying. Does not have to be just cutting up into fragments. It can clarify something. It can be bringing insight intellectually, and maybe through the intellect being clear about something, there can also be insight into the actuality of what one is talking about. I remember going to school in this country after coming from Europe. I had not been able to go to school in Germany. And I was 25 years old when I started school. I was older than most of the other people. And I thoroughly enjoyed going to school. Every course I took, I enjoyed. And in looking back, it was not just an accumulating of new knowledge, which it was in many ways, but it was also in many cases a dropping false knowledge that I'd had, false ideas, which in the light of what I was reading and hearing in lectures did not hold, was not so. And this is a marvelous function of learning, that one also unlearns what is not so through careful research. On-the-spot research, I'm particularly thinking of anthropology. It was amazing, utterly amazing and fascinating to me to find out about the thorough relativeness of our cultural values, religious ideas, and social structures, man-woman ideas of what a man is and what his natural capacities are, what a woman and her natural capacities are. All of this was overturned by studying primitive society, where woman does things, can do things which here only a man would do. One society, I remember the name of it, she did everything. Bearing the children, taking care of the economics. Man was just more or less lying around the house. Of her. It was her house. Her family's house. Because it's delightful to hear when one is raised in a culture where the man is the head of the family. But it gave me a feeling for the relativity of all of that. Cultural conditioning. Which can change at any time if our thinking changes. So it's interesting to me too. I'm slightly changing the subject, although I'm still with thought being fragmenting and a fragment itself. In the last retreat in Germany, there was a man, a participant who was a psychoanalyst and a very clear, sharp thinker. And he told me in a meeting after talk that he just in this talk wanted to see what words does she use, what is her background, how does she put things, and so forth. And he said he came to the conclusion that I'm very analytical, a very analytical person. And he proceeded to explain to me, because I was quite shocked to hear that. After a talk, to be told this was very analytical. And he had reasons for terming it that way. He said, you take one thing, like fear, and you give explanations for it, and that's being analytical. And how can one convey? It's good when input like this comes, because it shows that something is not conveyed, also maybe not heard. Because if you already sit in an attitude or an intention to analyze what is being said, will you inevitably find that what is said is analytical, because you're analyzing what somebody says. And yet I looked at that, and maybe I'm not conveying sufficiently that when we look at fear, we are not saying that this is something separate from the rest of this organism, from the rest of each other, like I just said a little while ago. And in looking at it, I don't feel separate from what I'm saying, or from you, or from the dripping sounds. Someone breathing, someone moving. And yet words are being used to describe something, or to describe a way of being when there's fear. And obviously, the words cannot convey the whole thing, can they? Oneself has to be the whole thing. Words cannot convey it. Or the words describing such a state is still just words, unless the listener is in that same state. That it's seen, yes, the words are a part, but the state of listening or talking is not. Is open and not identified with what is being said. And I think this is, I'm not quite sure I remember correctly, but this is what I was trying to point out yesterday. There's a difference whether our thoughts revolve around me, being identified with what I say, being therefore defensive of it, this being like part of me, and if someone questions it or criticizes it, I feel personally attacked because these words are me. I'm identified with what I say as mine, validating or confirming my existence as a knower. Or whether the words don't come out of such a state of being, not out of identification, there's no identification taking place, no axe to grind, or no intention to impress someone, but looking at something communally together. The questions itself arising out of what comes up in working here, alone and together. So words do not necessarily come out of this self-centered concern which so much pervades our life and has pervaded human life. And with which we come to one of the questions which came up in several meetings. What makes for the sense of separateness, which we all feel so strongly, so often, most of the time? Some people say, having begun to look at this, I am I all the time. One moving, sitting, sleeping, working I. And in that feeling separate from others. What makes for this feeling of separation? Is one interested in? Does one feel it? And does one feel the conflict of it? The problems it inevitably carries, brings with it? And how does it, is it something unalterable, something natural, inherited, human nature, or something real? We are separate. One will say we are separate because when I feel a pain, you don't feel it. When you have a pain in your knee, I don't feel it. We have different looks, different inherited capabilities. Our looks also are due to what we have, not completely, to a large extent to what we have inherited. But also the way we think about ourselves affects the way we look. And in our society, maybe in other societies too, certainly in the ones I'm familiar with, the differences between people are stressed and admired if somebody has tremendous talents. One wants to be close to somebody who's famous. In school, stresses differences. We talked about that yesterday or the day before by grading children. ABC or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or words. Parents stress emphatically how different their children are. And often this is used as sort of a proof that the same environment produces different children. In spite of the same environment, children are so different. I don't question the fact that it's known that different hereditary combinations produce different organisms, different hereditary combinations coming from parents and all of their ancestors. So that one child may be mathematically gifted, the other one artistically gifted. But I'm questioning whether, scientifically speaking, parents provide the same environment for two different children. Very often the first child one feels very anxious, is one doing things right with this child, or when all of one's child-rearing principles are still very strong. And if one is open to seeing what some of these child-rearing principles produce and problems, one may back off with a second child. Often it's said, the first one never slept, the second one sleeps like a dream. But maybe there's less anxiety about a child going to sleep. More at easiness with having a child. Or more nervousness because now there are two. Than when there was just one. So to say that the environment is the same does not hold. And two children walking, and mother may be holding twins, one in each hand. One may see an accident happening in the street, the other not witness it. And of course, parents also have preferences. We do. The easier child, a child that is less feisty, less rebellious, or more helpful or accommodating. And that sort of is a cyclical thing. Mutual feedback, which may not happen with another child, for whatever reason. But we were asking, what makes for this individual feeling of separateness? Does one feel it? Everyone I talk to, when we're talking about, feels that. Not just a feeling of separateness, but a deep conviction that one is separate from others. And giving all kind of reasons, like the one with the pain is very often used. When you have a pain, I don't feel it. But that holds true for all of us. We feel the pain that originates in our particular organism. It's true for all of us. And why do we think in those terms? Why do we think in terms of differences? As already thinking that I don't feel your pain makes me different from you. If one doesn't think that way, maybe one can feel the pain. Not precisely. No nervous system feels pain precisely the same way another nervous system does. We'll never be able to tell as something that's unprovable. But when one doesn't think constantly about oneself and one's separation, then it's not so hard to see somebody in pain and to feel that pain in a certain way. Not feel separated by that. And people who are looking at this, when we look at it, I look at it all the time myself, I look at it when it comes up. One realizes that our thinking about ourselves inevitably makes us feel separate. The thoughts circulating around oneself make for a feeling of separation. Bringing oneself in connection through thought with everything one sees or around one, in people and in things, establishes immediately the separation. I like this, or I don't like that. I don't like the way he is. Bringing him, his behavior, in connection with me. Thinking about it. He is impeding me, or he's getting ahead of me. She's getting in my way. Maybe thinking that she wants to impede me, she wants to obstruct me. We talked in one of the earlier talks about a car getting in ahead of us, maybe pulling out of a driveway and ahead of us. The anger that comes up and the feeling he's doing this or she's doing this against me. And then we were talking about it, the feeling I got to do that to her or him to make him feel how it is, or just wanting to have a revenge for this. All of this has to do with thinking about it, doesn't it? A car pulling out in front of one, we've all done it ourselves. Not necessarily because one wants to do something to someone else, keep him back or get in his or her way, but when one isn't looking. So we're interpreting what people do with reference to ourselves. And that comes out of a feeling of separation and reinforces the feeling of separation. And in the midst of this, and maybe suffering from this, from the anger over it, or the irritation, or the then disgust at oneself for being angry and irritated by all of this, by other people, can one look at the situation anew, afresh? Maybe one was interpreting wrong. Maybe there could be another interpretation or no interpretation. This is just what happened. With a mind that is not referring everything to me, but looking without that reference point, which means not thinking about oneself in relation to an event, which has to be observed that it is taking place, else we can't, there won't be any change. We will continue feeling irritated or divided, separate, and suffer from it. And yet reinforce it all the time, reaffirm it. I remember one person telling me she had done meditation for years and been a teacher of meditation for years. Said, I never realized that everything I look at, I put myself in relationship to through thinking. She verbalized it very clearly because she saw it very clearly. She said, I can't look at a tree without bringing myself in relationship with it. Somebody reported that here, noticing that. Stepping outside, this person reported on a beautiful evening, looking at the stars, and somebody else was there also looking at the stars. And the thought arising, I am impinging upon that person by my presence. I see it can go both ways. Somebody else may have thought, this person is impinging upon my presence. I want to be here unobstructed by anyone, or not competing with anyone. But this person felt I'm imposing or impinging upon this person who's been looking. And I'm sure they didn't just stand in front of each other. And this person was one of the first meetings, brought up the question, what is self-consciousness? Because it seems to get in the way wherever I am. Being so self-conscious about what I do. What my influence is, my impact. Of course, it's usually not only those thoughts, it's also how do others see me? How do they like me? How do I impress them? Am I being approved of? admired, or just sort of the thought, look at me, like little children say that. They're so open about it, unencumbered. Look at me. Our little granddaughter, she likes to cradle. Maybe I've talked about this, but she likes to cradle like a baby. She's 3 now, but she loves to be cradled in the arm. And of course, one loves to cradle a little cuddly child in one's arms and talk to her. And Ben came up to talk with me, and Adie took my head and just turned it toward her, away from Ben. She didn't say, look at me, but that was much more realistic. Just turn the head. And the jealousies that arise in children when one doesn't, but when the second one comes. Because these words can hide jealousy. Let's rather observe what happens and what we're doing to cause things to happen in each other. What effect we do have, not by thinking about it solely, but by observing it. Thinking is one way, but looking, well, am I really in his way? There's enough room on this hill and in this sky for many of us to probe into what is habit, self-effacing, or try to be non-intruding because maybe from the past one has been rewarded for it or punished for intruding. And a habit has built up over the years of thinking anxiously, am I doing this? Well, will I be not thought of properly if I do that? So how do we talk to ourselves about ourselves from moment to moment? Can one listen in? Because that makes for a feeling of separation. Inevitably. Unless seeing it clarifies it. And when it's seen as a happening, then other happenings are also there. The mind opens up to more than what I am doing and thinking about that. I'm not saying what I just said may sound as though one needn't be sensitive about how one impacts each other. One can be sensitive about that out of the situation by looking. And thoughts may be in there, but not this circular, looping thinking about oneself, which we're engaged with most of the time, maybe unawares. What about the fact that we do look different, have different body build and abilities, physical capacities, and so forth? Does that divide us from each other? Does it need to divide us from each other? If we don't attach to it in ourselves, or wish we were like someone else, or are glad we're not like somebody else, are the differences themselves the dividing factor? Or our way of thinking and the way people have thought about us and compared us, praised us and blamed us? Because if we have certain talents and they have been rewarded through words, through grades, through kindly looks by teachers, or a pat on the shoulder, or a star on the paper, then we feel we are the owners of those capacities. We have mathematical talent or artistic talent. I have that. As though this was one's own. And one's paintings or one's papers that one writes, one's books that one writes, they are evidence of one's whatever. Being special, noteworthy, different from others. But one can reflect upon, where do these capacities come from in the first place? We didn't create them for ourselves. There's again inheritance at play. Inheritance going back to infinity, it seems. It's not infinite, but if one thinks about it, where can one trace everything that has come down to us? Maybe someday a computer will do it. That would be marvelous to look. How all of the networking of inherited traits results in this one and that one and that one, but how it's all interconnected, interrelated. Would that be a humbling thing to us? To relinquish being that or having that. It's just something that is functioning in us. Just as something is different is functioning in someone else, but we are working together on this earth. We're living together. Not jealous or envious of each other's different capabilities. Because the way we've been brought up has a lot to do with how these capabilities either flourish or wither. If I had grown up in a ghetto, a black ghetto, poor, impoverished families who are not even families very often, crack, selling, buying, smoking, or whatever one does with crack, inhaling it or eating it. What does one do? It would be different, obviously, than growing in a middle-class, German, biracial family. Parents, scientists, have a different impact upon one than if they're business people. I'm not saying that disparagingly. I used to. I felt immensely proud. Told everybody at first shot, if I could get my word in, what my father was. That was me. I was identified with that. Proud of it. So, depending on where we grow up, this conditions us. We're outraged at a rapist, murderer. But what if we had grown up under those conditions? Very likely we would do the same thing. We don't know for sure. All kinds of influences impinge, and also heredity. But more likely than not, growing up under certain circumstances would be our behavior very much affected, molded, and determined. can one shed or relinquish without effort this feeling of being special or wanting to be special? Very often one doesn't feel special, but one strives with all one's might, studying or working to become somebody special in other people's eyes or in one's own eyes or one's parents' eyes. Which means not doing whatever one is doing for its own sake, for the joy of learning or discovering, but in order to become somebody, impress somebody, make good in someone's eyes. One's parents usually loom large. Can one question all of it, just leisurely as we're questioning it now? Not say, I must not feel different, or I must fight the self, the me. Often, by talking about it, it is assumed it's something bad and therefore it's good not to have it. And since we're conditioned to have to want the good and shun or get rid of the bad, a talk may do the same thing. And what is important is that we see things without judgment, without good and bad, or else we don't see it clearly. It already distorts the vision to think that me-related thoughts are bad. And they don't come into clear daylight. And one doesn't need to identify it with it. Say, woe me, how terrible I am. We're all like that. We're examining and looking into human beings manifesting right here. Here's where one can look best and clearest. Although we often think we can look clearer at someone else. But that's only because we don't want to see the same thing in ourselves. We're afraid of detecting selfishness, self-centeredness, greed, envy, anger. Because we have these ideal pictures of how a good person is like. And to those we attach, and that's what we hope or think is me. And that hides and shields, clouds what is actually going on in thought. Not just in action, also in thought. Because thinking affects our whole body and our actions very, very strongly. And yet the mind is able to fragment, not to see what we're doing, to believe we're doing something else while we're doing something different. Not to realize what we're doing is possible. The way the brain operates, in hiding or rationalizing so strongly that what we're actually doing is not discovered. We stay with the rationalization. And in this investigation I'm looking right now, the thought is involved too, isn't it? One reflects upon these things. And as the person was pointing out to me, thought can be very clarifying in seeing something or thinking about something intelligently, clearly. And dropping a notion or a thought that is found to be incorrect, inaccurate. And yet not to confuse that with what we're talking about later, constantly thinking about oneself. And that can't be described any further. One has to come upon it, and maybe has come upon it time and time again. And then with that, the feeling of isolation, division. And maybe this can only really be understood if there are moments in which this thought does not take place and there is no feeling of division. If that has never happened, then it seems just like talking about one more ideal state that I should be reaching, not thinking about myself, not feeling divided. More thought, more feeling of division from somebody else who may be able to do that. And yet these moments do happen for all of us at one time or another. One may not even be aware that there is awareness because one isn't thinking about it. It's just awareness. The moment we think, oh, I'm aware, then thought begins to divide me from others or from this instant of awareness. And as pure awareness, there's no thought about being aware. And there's just clarity and no feeling of separation. Somebody brought this question up in connection, it was earlier, with somebody having driven in front of you, and then one sort of revs up the car and drives in front of that person at one time or another, maybe a little bit later when it's not quite as dangerous as it was at the moment. And the person was asking, not with a chip on the shoulder, not just asking, don't we in a way have to do that? Sort of not be nobodies who let everything happen to us, that anybody wishes to do to us. Don't we need to assert ourselves? Something like that. Because if we don't, that was the conclusion. If we don't, we would just be nobodies. That's a conclusion. What we are when the urge to do the same thing to someone else that he or she has done to me, when that urge is quiet, what we are, one has to find out directly. It cannot be speculated upon. But it's not the concept or the idea of being nobody. Maybe it's just intelligence operating and seeing how dangerous it is. And perpetuating violence and conflict. If we continuously do to others what they do to us. Which is endless, isn't it? Because then there's already a new reason for that person to do this to someone, to us or someone else. And the war doesn't end. It's also operating out of an instinct. There almost seems to be an instinct in us to eye for eye and tooth for tooth it. I don't want to use that word. Maybe it's not good. It's a strong, deeply ingrained habit. Whether this comes from observing it all around us, the children, or whether it is where it comes from, I don't know. Inherited. These days there's talk of fields, that morphogenic fields that affect all of us in similar ways. Once an action has taken place, it's more likely to take place even in another human being. Not just in that same human being. So, just because we feel this operating, will we justify it, rationalize it, because it gives a sense of relief for received hurt or humiliation to humiliate back? Or will there be the energy to pause and look at the thing? On the molecular level, on the small level, what happens possibly to two cars, and on the global level, on as wide a level as we are able to look. And reflection may be an aid, a tool in that, to think about it, to think it out. Thinking does not bring freedom from this urge. Freedom from this urge to pay back can only happen if it's directly seen with an awareness that is not self-centered, that doesn't come out of me, my needs, my urges, my rights, my image. And that awareness cannot come into being as long as rationalization of what is going on takes place. We justify it. But we can question our rationalizations, and that's the marvelous thing. We don't have to go with it forever. We can wonder about it, stop in our tracks, and look and listen freshly. What does it mean to be nobody? Not as a concept, an image, or an idea. We're so afraid of it. We're afraid of the idea of it, the fantasy of it, or being stepped upon or hurt or humiliated, without being able to hit back. That we feel is the being of a nobody. For that we have to see what we hold on to, what we are. The ideas about ourselves. And that they are ideas, abstractions. What we really are from one moment to the next, no words can cover. Volumes could be written and never exhaust. By the time they're written, we are old and gray. What are we from moment to moment when we don't know? Not just depend on our ideas to tell us, or words to inform us, theories or descriptions. It needs a directness of observation, doesn't it? Awareness. From moment to moment, not perfect. Interrupted by long spans or short spans of inattention in which our habits take over. But at a moment of awareness, the fact that habit was there can be seen. It still reverberates in memory. And need not be judged, need not be changed, need not be interfered with. There's awareness now. It needs nothing. had a moment of not thinking about myself. What am I? Or is that question irrelevant? We will end here for today.